They don't tell you the real danger in relationships. They warn you about cheating, about arguments, about boredom. They tell you to keep things fresh, to communicate more, to compromise harder. But they never tell you about the slowest, most corrosive poison of all, contempt. Contempt is not an explosion. It's not a sudden betrayal. It's a leak, a drip, a small crack in the foundation that widens silently until the entire structure collapses. It doesn't arrive with screaming or violence. It arrives with a sigh, a rolled eye, a sarcastic remark delivered with just enough sting to remind you that you are no longer respected. And once contempt enters a relationship, desire, trust, and loyalty begin to rot from the inside out. Picture this. You're sitting at dinner. You make a joke you think is light-hearted. She doesn't laugh. She exhales sharply, shakes her head, and mutters under her breath, "You're ridiculous." The words are small, but the message is massive. You are not funny. You are not respected. You are not taken seriously. And in that moment, something deeper than anger takes root. Anger can burn hot and fade, but contempt freezes. It calcifies. It stays. Every man who has felt it knows the sensation. You're talking, but she's scrolling. You're explaining, but she's smirking. You're giving effort, but she's responding with silence, or worse, with mockery. And you feel the sting in your nervous system, the quiet voice that whispers, "I am no longer admired. I am being tolerated." That's the beginning of the spiral. Because contempt is not just disrespect, it's dehumanization. It's the moment she no longer sees you as a man worth following, worth admiring, worth desiring. You become a fixture, a utility, a tolerated annoyance. And here's the brutal truth. Once contempt sets in, it rarely reverses. Relationships don't survive contempt. They die slowly, one sarcastic jab, one eye roll, one withheld kiss at a time. The psychologists who studied long-term marriages discovered a terrifying predictor of divorce. It wasn't financial stress, it wasn't infidelity, it wasn't even constant conflict. The number one predictor was contempt, the look that says, "I don't respect you," the tone that says, "You are beneath me," the micro-expressions that say, "You are small." And the worst part, men in contempt-filled relationships often don't even notice it at first because they confuse contempt with stress, with mood, with personality. They tell themselves, "She's just tired. She's just having a bad day. She still loves me." But deep down, their nervous system knows the truth. Contempt is not temporary. It's a code, a shift in how she perceives you at the deepest level. And once the code is rewritten, everything changes. Passion turns to duty. Intimacy turns to obligation. Respect turns to ridicule. The spiral begins quietly, one small sign, then another, until one day you wake up and realize the woman who once looked at you with admiration now looks at you with disdain. And here's the hardest pill to swallow. Contempt doesn't start with her. It starts with you. With the small compromises, the weak boundaries, the quiet self-erasure that made you cheap in her eyes. Contempt doesn't arrive from nowhere. It is invited slowly by the man who abandons himself in the hope of being loved. This episode is not about anger. It's not about arguments. It's about the deadliest virus of attraction, the contempt spiral. The hidden psychology that transforms love into disgust, respect into mockery, passion into silence. And once you see how it works, you will understand the brutal law of relationships. Contempt is the end game, the final station before collapse. And if you don't recognize it, you won't survive it. So listen carefully, because what you're about to hear is not pretty, it's not romantic, it's not hopeful. It is the darkest layer of the code. And once you see it, you will never look at a sigh, a smirk, or a mocking tone the same way again. To understand contempt, you cannot treat it as just another argument or a phase in relationships. Contempt is not frustration. Contempt is not disagreement. Contempt is a neurological and psychological reclassification. It is the brain rewriting someone from partner to subordinate. And once that recoding happens, every interaction is poisoned. Psychology tells us that contempt is built on a foundation of superiority. Anger says, "I disagree with you." Disgust says, "I don't want this near me." But contempt says, "I am above you." It is the emotional equivalent of spitting down from a balcony. It combines judgment, rejection, and disrespect in a single micro-expression: the sneer, the smirk, the eye roll. In laboratories studying couples, contempt was so predictive of collapse that researchers could watch a 15-minute interaction and know with frightening accuracy which marriages would fail. Why does contempt corrode faster than anger? Because anger still implies engagement. When someone is angry with you, it means you still matter. Your actions still register. Your presence still carries weight. Contempt, however, is disengagement. It is the declaration that you are beneath notice, that your presence is more irritating than meaningful. And once that judgment is internalized, it is almost impossible to undo. Neuroscience sharpens the picture. The human brain processes contempt differently than other negative emotions. In fMRI studies, contempt lights up regions associated not only with disgust, but also with moral judgment. This means that when someone feels contempt toward you, they are not merely upset, they believe you are less than. Their nervous system codes you as unworthy of respect, unworthy of attraction, unworthy even of equal footing. This is why contempt feels so devastating. It does not attack your actions, it attacks your essence. Now layer in social psychology. Respect and attraction operate on the law of scarcity. We value what is rare, disciplined, and difficult to control. When a man begins to erode his boundaries, when he over-explains, over-apologizes, or over-sacrifices, he lowers his perceived value. He becomes predictable, cheap, replaceable. At first, this breeds comfort. Eventually, it breeds contempt. Because the brain does not admire what it can control, it resents it. Evolutionary psychology adds an even darker twist. In ancestral tribes, contempt was a survival signal. A member who was weak, submissive, or unreliable threatened the group's survival. Contempt was the nervous system's way of marking someone as expendable, a liability to be avoided or cast out. That instinct remains in modern relationships. A woman may not consciously decide it, but when she begins to sneer, to mock, to roll her eyes, her nervous system is flagging. This man is not fit to lead. This man is not fit to follow. Contempt also spreads like a virus. Once one partner begins to drip-feed it into interactions, the other partner responds in kind, either defensively with anger or passively with silence. Either way, the cycle accelerates. Respect erodes. Intimacy dies. Attraction vanishes. What's left is performance, a hollow play where two actors recite their lines, but the script is already doomed. Here lies the brutal paradox. Contempt almost never begins as contempt. It begins as disappointment, as frustration, as small, unchallenged acts of disrespect, the joke that cuts a little too deep, the boundary ignored without consequence, the sarcastic tone tolerated instead of confronted. Every time the man lets these seeds grow unchecked, the soil of the relationship becomes fertile for contempt. And when contempt blooms, it does not wilt, it strangles. So here is the psychological reality. Contempt is not just an emotion, it is a reclassification. It is the nervous system rewriting the story of who you are, from partner to subordinate, from equal to inferior, from man to tolerated presence. And unless you learn to recognize the signs, you will wake up one day not in a relationship, but in a slow-motion funeral where desire, respect, and sovereignty have all been buried alive. If contempt were only one emotion, you could fight it with one gesture. a sincere apology, a grand display, a single act of change. But contempt is not simple. It is an ecosystem. It is a set of hidden mechanisms that, once triggered, accelerate like a spiral, dragging both partners deeper into collapse. Let's break down the 5 invisible gears that drive the contempt machine. 1. The micro-expression mechanism, the silent signal of superiority. Contempt does not begin with shouting. It begins with a look, the eye roll, the sneer, the corner of the lip raised in mockery. These micro-expressions are so brief, the conscious mind may not register them, but the nervous system always does. A single flash of contempt in her eyes tells your brain, "You are beneath me." And once that signal is received, respect starts to erode silently, like rust eating through steel. You may argue words, but you cannot argue the sneer. It is already engraved in memory. 2. The comparison mechanism. The shadow of other men. Contempt often grows in the soil of comparison. When she looks at you and thinks, other men are stronger, bolder, more decisive, contempt blooms. Sometimes she says it outright, mentioning an ex, praising another man's decisiveness. Other times it's silent, written in her tone. This mechanism hijacks evolutionary coding. Women are wired to assess fitness. When you collapse into predictability, when you lose polarity, her nervous system begins to compare. And every comparison you lose plants another seed of contempt. 3. The over-explanation mechanism. The death of authority, one of the fastest accelerators of contempt, is over-explaining. The endless justifications, the desperate attempts to be understood. Each extra word signals weakness. Each defensive explanation says, "I need you to validate me." Respect does not live in apology loops. It dies there. This is why silence often carries more authority than explanation. When you cannot hold your frame, when you bleed out words to prove yourself, her nervous system no longer sees authority, it sees insecurity, and insecurity is fertile ground for contempt. 4. The boundary erosion mechanism. Death by 1,000 cuts. Contempt thrives where boundaries die. The ignored insult, the sarcastic jab laughed off, the raised voice tolerated instead of confronted. Every time you let a small act of disrespect slide, you teach her nervous system one thing: I can push, and he will not hold. Over time, the relationship stops being a partnership and becomes a dominance hierarchy, with you at the bottom. She may not consciously plan it, but subconsciously her respect collapses. Contempt does not explode overnight. It accumulates in the graveyard of your abandoned standards. 5. The resentment feedback loop. When contempt feeds itself, once contempt takes root, it creates a feedback loop. Her sneers make you defensive. Your defensiveness makes her roll her eyes harder. Her withdrawal makes you chase. Your chasing confirms her sense of superiority. And so the spiral accelerates, each round feeding the next. Eventually, contempt becomes the default setting of the relationship. Jokes turn sharp. Touch turns cold. Every interaction is layered with subtext. You are beneath me. And once a relationship reaches this stage, intimacy does not just fade, it calcifies into disdain. These 5 mechanisms, micro-expressions, comparisons, over-explaining, boundary erosion, and the resentment loop, are not random accidents. They are predictable gears in the contempt spiral. And if you do not see them, if you do not name them, you will mistake contempt for frustration, disrespect for misunderstanding, and disdain for a rough patch. But contempt is not a rough patch. Contempt is the beginning of the end. Unless you learn to break these mechanisms, you are not in a relationship, you are in a countdown. If contempt is a spiral, then survival means learning how to cut the gears that drive it. You cannot plead contempt away. You cannot out-explain it. You cannot buy back respect with gifts, devotion, or sacrifice. Once contempt appears, the only way to stop it is to break the mechanics that feed it. Here are the 5 survival strategies mapped directly to the hidden mechanisms of contempt. 1. Neutralize the micro-expression mechanism. Break the sneer before it becomes law. When you see the eye roll, the smirk, the subtle sneer, don't ignore it. If you let it pass, you teach her nervous system that it's safe to treat you as inferior. But don't explode either. That only feeds the frame. The survival tactic is calm confrontation. Call it out once, clearly, without anger. That look is disrespectful. Don't do that again. You don't need a lecture. You need a boundary. A single clear response is enough to interrupt the microsignal before it calcifies into the new language of the relationship. 2. Break the comparison mechanism. Stop playing a rigged game. The moment you start competing with invisible men, exes, co-workers, or imagined rivals, you've already lost. Contempt thrives on comparison because it frames you as lacking. The survival move is not to argue that you're better, it's to reject the comparison outright. Frame yourself as incomparable. I don't compete with other men. Either you respect me or this ends here. When you remove yourself from the race, the mechanism collapses. She cannot measure you against others if you refuse to run on that track. 3. Kill the over-explanation mechanism. Cut the loop of defensiveness. When contempt shows up, most men panic into words. They explain, they justify, they beg to be understood, and every word lowers their status further. The survival rule is simple. One clear statement, then silence. That's not acceptable. I've said what I mean. After that, nothing more. You will feel the urge to keep talking, to clarify, to convince. Resist it. Authority lives in restraint. Silence radiates more weight than paragraphs ever will. Break the loop by refusing to feed it. 4. Rebuild boundaries. Seal the leaks that feed contempt. Every tolerated insult, every small test ignored, every disrespect excused, teaches her nervous system that you have no standards, and contempt loves a man with no standards. The survival rule is the boundary ledger. Write down 3 lines that cannot be crossed, your non-negotiables. Maybe it's name-calling, maybe it's ridicule in public, maybe it's dismissing your work. Decide them now and enforce them ruthlessly. When the boundary is crossed, withdraw your attention, your presence, or your participation immediately. Not with drama, with clarity. Respect returns when standards return. 5. Break the resentment loop. Flip the spiral into a reset. Contempt feeds itself. Her sneer makes you defensive. Your defensiveness confirms her superiority. The only way to break the loop is to stop playing your role in it. The tactic is pattern interruption. When the cycle begins, her jab, your instinct to argue, don't follow the script. Pause, step back, change the energy entirely. Sometimes it means silence. Sometimes it means walking away. Sometimes it means shifting to action instead of words. The key is this. You don't reinforce the spiral. You break it by refusing to play your expected part. Together, these 5 tactics form the survival manual. Neutralize micro-expressions with boundaries. Break comparisons by rejecting the race. Kill over-explaining with silence. Rebuild respect through non-negotiable standards. Break resentment loops with pattern interruption. None of these require shouting. None require begging. All require sovereignty, because contempt cannot survive in the presence of a man who will not be diminished. The sneer dies when it meets steel. The comparisons collapse when they face certainty. The loops end when silence cuts the script. The spiral breaks when your standards rise higher than her tests. Contempt is not the end if you refuse to let it be. But if you ignore it, tolerate it, or try to outtalk it, the spiral accelerates until nothing remains but ash. Your survival depends not on her mood, but on your frame. Hold it, command it, protect it. Contempt is the quiet cancer of relationships. It rarely begins with screaming matches or explosive betrayals. It starts with a glance, a sigh, a sneer too small to notice, until it becomes the default language. And once contempt takes hold, it spreads. Respect evaporates, desire corrodes, love mutates into performance. If you have felt this spiral, you know its brutality. No matter how hard you try, the more you give, the less you are respected. The more you explain, the less you are heard. The more you sacrifice, the less you are desired. But here's the truth that most men never hear. Contempt does not kill you unless you let it. It only destroys the man who surrenders his frame, who ignores the signals, who explains when he should enforce, who begs when he should withdraw. The spiral ends not with her change, but with yours. It ends the moment you refuse to be diminished. Think of contempt like fire. Left unchecked, it burns your house down. But fire also needs fuel. And the fuel of contempt is your compliance. Every ignored boundary, every nervous justification, every desperate plea feeds the flames. When you stop feeding it, the fire starves. When you anchor yourself in silence, boundaries and standards, contempt cannot grow. It collapses under its own weight. So here is your choice. You can stay on the spiral, hoping that if you prove yourself enough, the sneers will turn back into smiles. They won't. Or you can step off the spiral completely, not with rage, not with endless speeches, but with gravity, with the quiet, immovable presence of a man who refuses to be treated as less. Contempt cannot survive in the presence of sovereignty, and if you feel the sting of this, don't despair. Take it as clarity. You now see what most men never dare to see, the real cause of their silent suffering. Awareness is power. Because once you see contempt for what it is, you can stop begging for scraps and start demanding respect. You can stop living as a man who tries to be tolerated and start living as a man who commands admiration. But this is only one layer of the code. Contempt is a poison, yes, but it's not the only one. Beneath it lies an even darker economy, the endless chase for validation. The subtle addiction that turns men into approval junkies, bleeding respect with every text, every compliment, every instant reaction. If contempt is the spiral that kills respect, validation is the fuel that makes men weak long before contempt begins. So here's your challenge. Stop tolerating contempt. Stop justifying it. Stop feeding it. The next time you feel the sneer, the eye roll, the sigh, remember, that is not your cue to explain, it is your cue to enforce. Hold your frame, protect your standards. And if respect cannot live in that space, then neither should you. This is the law. Love without respect is theater. Intimacy without admiration is illusion. And a man without sovereignty is not a partner, he is a servant. Refuse to play that role. Reclaim your role as the one who sets the tone, the pace, the gravity. The spiral ends when you decide it does. And if you want to go deeper, if you want to see the hidden machinery behind every test, every manipulation, every collapse of respect, then don't stop here. Subscribe. Stay with me. Turn on notifications. Because in the next episode, we will expose the validation economy itself. And once you see how it drains you, you will never play its game again. Because survival is not luck. Survival is awareness. And awareness begins now.